There are certain nights that stay with you forever, not because something dramatic happened, but because no matter how hard you try to explain it, nothing ever makes sense. For me, it happened on the last train home. I've told this story to a few people over the years. Most of them assume I was tired, or that I imagined everything after working a long shift. Honestly, I wish that were true, because if it was just my imagination, then I wouldn't still avoid that train line 2 years later. This happened during the winter of 2024. I was 28 years old, working as a bartender in downtown Chicago. My shift usually ended around midnight, sometimes later if the bar stayed busy. Since parking downtown cost more than I could afford, I relied on the city's train system. I had the schedule memorized. If I missed the last train, I'd either spend over $100 on a rideshare or wait until sunrise. So every night, I'd finish cleaning, count my tips, grab my backpack, and practically jog to the station. I'd taken that last train hundreds of times. Nothing unusual had ever happened, until one Friday night. The bar had been packed because of a hockey game nearby. By the time we finished cleaning everything, it was already after 1 a.m. I barely made it to the station before the departure board changed. Last train, 1:08 a.m. I tapped my transit card and hurried downstairs. The platform felt strangely quiet. There were maybe 6 other people waiting. A guy in a business suit staring at his phone, a young couple arguing quietly, an older woman holding 2 grocery bags, a college student with headphones around his neck, and a janitor pushing a cleaning cart toward a service hallway. That was everyone. A cold wind rushed through the tunnel. A few seconds later, the train arrived. The doors slid open with a soft hiss. I stepped inside and found a seat near the middle of the second car. The seats were mostly empty, exactly how I liked them. The train pulled away right on schedule. For the first 20 minutes, everything felt completely normal. People got off one stop at a time. The couple left first, then the older woman. The businessman got off downtown. Eventually, only 3 passengers remained: me, the college student, and a man sitting near the far end of the car reading a newspaper. I remember thinking how strange it was that anyone still read an actual newspaper. The train continued through the city. Outside the windows, apartment buildings slowly gave way to warehouses and empty parking lots. The farther we traveled, the quieter everything became. The announcement echoed through the speakers. Next stop, Black Ridge Terminal. Final stop, all passengers must exit the train. The student stood up immediately. The older man folded his newspaper and placed it neatly under his arm. I grabbed my backpack. The train slowed. The brakes squealed. Then, we stopped. The doors opened. The student stepped onto the platform without looking back. The older man followed a few seconds later. I stood up, but before I could take a step, the overhead lights flickered, just once. I looked toward the platform. At first, it looked completely empty. Then I noticed someone standing near the far end. They weren't walking. They weren't looking at a phone. They weren't waiting near the exits like everyone else normally did. They were simply standing there, perfectly still, wearing what looked like a long, dark coat. Their face was hidden beneath the shadow of a hood. I assumed they were waiting for someone. Then something strange happened. The warning chime sounded. The doors should have started closing. Instead, they stayed open. 5 seconds passed, then 10. Nobody moved. The figure slowly lifted their head. Even from that distance, I couldn't make out a face, only darkness beneath the hood. Then, they started walking, not toward the station exit, toward my train. Each step echoed across the empty platform. Slow, steady, almost mechanical. Something about the way they walked immediately made me uncomfortable. It wasn't the speed, it wasn't the clothes, it was the complete lack of urgency. Like they already knew the train wasn't leaving without them. Every instinct told me to step outside before they reached the carriage. Instead, I stood there watching. The figure reached the doorway, stopped, then stepped inside. The instant both feet crossed the threshold, the train doors slammed shut. Without warning, the train started moving again. I grabbed the nearest pole to keep my balance. My stomach dropped. That wasn't possible. Black Ridge Terminal was the end of the line. There weren't supposed to be tracks beyond this station. Yet somehow, the train continued forward. Outside the windows, the platform disappeared. Only darkness remained. Not city lights, not tunnels. Just endless black. I looked toward the emergency intercom beside the door and pressed the call button. Nothing happened. No response. No light. No sound. I pulled out my phone. No signal. Not even one bar. When I looked back toward the other end of the carriage, the hooded passenger was gone. There was nowhere they could have gone. The train hadn't stopped. The doors had never opened. Yet, the carriage was empty. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard someone whisper, "You stayed too long." Every muscle in my body locked up. I spun around so fast, I nearly lost my balance. There was nobody behind me. The carriage was completely empty. The whisper had sounded so close that I could have sworn someone was standing inches from my shoulder. I stared down both ends of the train. Nothing. Just rows of empty seats lit by flickering fluorescent lights. For a moment, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Maybe the sound had come through the train speakers. Maybe I was just exhausted after a 12-hour shift. I kept repeating those excuses in my head. None of them made me feel any better. I walked toward the emergency intercom again and pressed the button harder. Still nothing. The small red light that normally turned on never lit up. It was completely dead. I tried opening the door between train cars. The handle wouldn't move. It felt like it had been welded shut. I looked outside. The windows reflected the inside of the train more than anything beyond it. But every now and then, between my reflection, I thought I saw something moving alongside the train. Not running, not walking, just keeping pace with it, always hidden in the darkness. I blinked. It disappeared. A few seconds later, the overhead speakers crackled with loud static. I froze. Then a calm voice spoke. "This train is no longer in service." I frowned. That announcement made no sense. The train was obviously moving. The voice continued, "Please remain seated." Then, complete silence. About a minute later, the lights dimmed again. This time they stayed dim. The entire carriage was now lit by a dull yellow glow. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every corner looked darker. I noticed something that immediately made my stomach tighten. The newspaper the older man had been carrying was lying on the seat across from me. I knew he'd taken it with him when he got off. I'd watched him tuck it under his arm. Slowly. I walked over and picked it up. The paper felt damp, almost cold. The date printed across the top wasn't today's date. It wasn't even this year. It read, December 14th, 1996. I stared at it for several seconds. The headline caught my attention. Late night subway accident claims 9 lives. A blurry black and white photo showed a damaged train sitting inside a tunnel. I flipped the page over. Most of the article was impossible to read because the ink had faded, but one sentence remained perfectly clear. The final train never reached its destination. A loud bang echoed somewhere beneath the train. The lights flickered violently. The newspaper slipped from my hands. As I bent down to pick it up, I noticed muddy footprints on the floor. They hadn't been there before. One pair, large boot prints. They started at the carriage door, then continued slowly between the seats. I followed them with my eyes. Each footprint looked fresh, as if someone with soaking wet boots had just walked through. The trail ended at the seat directly across from mine, but the seat was empty. I backed away. My breathing became shallow. Then, the cushion slowly sank, not all at once, gradually, as if someone invisible had just sat down. I couldn't move. The air inside the carriage suddenly felt freezing cold. The train began slowing down. Finally, relief washed over me. Maybe we'd reached another station. Maybe I could get off. The brakes squealed. The train came to a complete stop. The doors slid open. I rushed toward them without thinking. Outside, there was another platform, but something was wrong. There were no signs, no maps, no benches, no advertisements. The station looked unfinished. Bare concrete walls stretched into darkness. The lights overhead buzzed weakly. There wasn't another person anywhere, not even a station employee. I stepped one foot onto the platform, then stopped. Something caught my eye, across the tracks. Another train was sitting in complete darkness. Only one light was on. Inside the last carriage, someone was standing perfectly still, looking directly at me. Then, they slowly raised one hand and pointed behind me. My heart stopped. I turned around. Standing inside my train, only a few feet away, was the hooded passenger. This time, they weren't facing the window. They were facing me, and although I still couldn't see a face, I knew. They were smiling. The train slowed to a stop. The station lights flickered through the windows. Finally, my stop. The doors slid open with a soft hiss. I stepped onto the empty platform as quickly as I could. Cold air hit my face. I didn't look back. I just kept walking. Behind me, the train doors remained open. I heard no footsteps, no voices, nothing. Just as I reached the stairs leading up to the street, a loud announcement echoed through the station speakers. "Attention passengers!" The voice crackled with static. "The final service has now ended." I stopped. Something about the announcement felt wrong. It sounded distorted, almost like someone was struggling to imitate the station announcer. Then it repeated, "Do not look back." Every hair on my arm stood up. I stood frozen for a second. Then, against my better judgment, I looked over my shoulder. The train was still there. The doors were still open, but the carriage was no longer empty. Every seat, every single one, was occupied. Dozens of people sat perfectly still. Men, women, children, all dressed in old-fashioned clothes from different decades. None of them moved. None of them blinked. Every single face was turned toward me, watching. Their expressions were completely blank. Then, one of them slowly raised a hand, not waving, pointing, toward the very last seat in the carriage, the same seat where the silent passenger had been sitting. It was empty now, but something was standing beside it. A tall figure, far too tall for the train. Its head almost touched the ceiling. Its face was impossible to make out, like it was hidden inside a shadow darker than the rest of the carriage. Slowly, it tilted its head toward me. The station lights flickered once, twice. When they came back, the train was empty again. The doors closed. The train pulled away without a sound. I stood there shaking. Eventually, I forced myself to leave the station. I told myself I was exhausted, that my mind had created everything after a long day. But when I got home, something strange happened. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from the city's transit app. I hadn't opened it in weeks. The notification simply read, "Thank you for riding with us tonight." Underneath, there was a trip summary. Departure station, correct. Arrival station, correct. Then, one final line, "Passengers on your train. 2. I frowned. That couldn't be right. Besides me, there had only been one other passenger, the silent man. But according to the app, I wasn't passenger 1, I was passenger 2. I tried opening the trip details. The page wouldn't load. A second later, the notification disappeared, as if it had never existed. The next morning, I searched online for anything unusual about that train line. Most results were ordinary. Maintenance updates, schedule changes, old news articles. Then I found a discussion on a local forum. Someone mentioned that years ago, the final train on that line had been involved in a fatal accident late at night near the last station. Several passengers had died. The line reopened months later. Most people had forgotten about it, except every now and then, someone claimed the last train carried more passengers than it should. People who weren't listed on any security cameras. People who never appeared in ticket records. People who got on at the final stop. I closed the website. I didn't want to read anymore. A few weeks later, my friends invited me downtown for dinner. By the time we finished, it was almost midnight. One of them asked if I wanted to take the train home. I smiled, shook my head, and called a taxi instead. It cost me almost $70, worth every cent. Because no matter how late it gets, I'll never ride the last train home again. And if you're ever sitting alone on a nearly empty train, and it stops at a station where no one is waiting, but you still hear footsteps climbing aboard, don't look up, don't make eye contact, and whatever you do, if the seat across from you suddenly becomes occupied, get off at the very next stop, even if it isn't yours.